We're privileged here at the University of Chicago to have the Institute of Politics and all the fantastic programming that it brings. And it's been a real pleasure working with David Axelrod and the rest of the team this year. And it's an honor to introduce tonight's panel. Campaigns for the presidency in 2012 faced an unprecedented media landscape. This week's programming examines the challenges and opportunities posed to political campaigns by the new legal and technological environment, and the strategies that they developed to deal with it. Social media and the array of cable television and online news sources. Am I too close?
No, I'm the radiators.
Okay. Social media and the array of cable news and online news sources available today make even 2008 seem like a much simpler time. Consider that the microblogging site Twitter reported a doubling in its number of active monthly users from 100 million to 200 million just between 2011 and 2012. As more people get their news and information from a wider variety of sources than ever before, campaigns have had to adapt new messaging and communication strategies to deal with it. Tonight's panel will offer us insight into the ways that both campaigns worked hard to use social media and cable news to their advantage in the last election. So we're pleased to welcome three distinguished panelists tonight. Stephanie Cutter is a Democratic communications strategist and consultant who most recently served as Deputy Campaign Manager for Obama for America. Previously, she served as Deputy Senior White House Advisor to President Obama and was a key advisor to First Lady Michelle Obama and to the Obama-Biden transition team. Stephanie has served in key communications roles for President Clinton, the Democratic National Committee, and Senators John Kerry and the late Ted Kennedy. Kevin Madden is a leading Republican communications consultant, having served as a senior advisor to Governor Mitt Romney's 2012 presidential campaign and as National Press Secretary and senior communications strategist for Romney's 2008 presidential campaign. Prior to joining Governor Romney's campaigns, Kevin was press secretary to then House Majority Leader and now House Speaker John Boehner, wherein he served as a top communications strategist for the House of Representatives Leadership Office. He's currently an executive vice president at JDA Frontline, which is a public affairs consulting firm. Finally, Ben LeBolt has had a long history of working in communications and media relations roles for President Obama. Most recently, he served as National Press Secretary for President Obama, or for Obama for America. Previously, he worked as a Deputy White House Press Secretary and as a leading spokesperson for Obama's 2008 presidential campaign and for his Senate office. Last but not least, moderating tonight's discussion is our own Steve Edwards. Steve is Deputy Director of Programming for the Institute of Politics and is a veteran journalist. His work has appeared on the BBC, Bloomberg News, PBS, and numerous public radio stations around the country. Most recently, he spent nearly 14 years at WBEZ Chicago, where he served as host of the popular daily shows The Afternoon Shift and The 848. So please join me in welcoming the panel to the University of Chicago.
All right. Catherine, thank you so much for the introduction. It's great to see so many of you here tonight for a conversation I'm personally excited about because, as Catherine mentioned, I've spent much of my career prior to joining the Institute in journalism and been fascinated by the work that people like Stephanie and Ben and Kevin do, been impressed by it, been frustrated by it as well. And I'm sure they could say the same thing about me and my
that was all by design.
Professional brother, exactly. So what we'll do is we'll have a conversation here for a bit and then open it up to questions from you. And we know that many of you are familiar with that format, and we hope that you will be characteristically excited, energetic, and contextual with your questions. But let me start, as we have with some of these other conversations in this series, rather than jumping into the deep substance of the topic at hand, by getting more information about just your own journey to this work that you've done at this phase in your career. And Ben, let me start down with you. What's your journey to the point where you become National Press Secretary of the President's re-election campaign?
Well, it started out growing up right around Chicago. You know, this is a city where I think politics is in your blood a little bit.
Yeah.
The mayor's the only game in town. It's filled with lots of political characters. Some of them end up in prison. Some of them seem to be more effective, but it's something that really drives the news and feels important here. And so I was interested in it from a very young age, but I didn't pursue it professionally. At any point, I thought I was, going to be like a marine biologist or something.
Really?
As a firefighter, and then you go through some weird phase. My weird phase was the marine biology phase, which is weird because I didn't even like science. And then I went to college in Vermont. And this is a state where they still do town hall meetings. 12 people in a town hall voting on something that the town cares about.
Yeah.
And that was a cool place to get involved in political organizing for the first time, getting people into a room and encourage them to vote for your candidate. Right after college, I went and I started out knocking on doors for Howard Dean. We know how that ended. Thanks, Stephanie. It was doing a campaign on the ground really whet my appetite, and you're promoted quickly on a campaign. I think campaigns are one of the final meritocracies in the world, where if you're good and you work hard, you get promoted quickly. And I left that, helped at a very low-level transition to communications, and helped out the Kerry campaign. And then I went to Capitol Hill and worked for Jan Schakowsky as her press secretary. And in a House office, you sort of have to do everything. It's 7 people. You do some policy, you do some communications. You pick the congresswoman up if nobody else is around. And that's a quick way to learn the ropes. I moved out to Ohio and helped elect Senator Sherrod Brown, and trailed behind his car across the state, and ate a lot of Bob Evans. And then I went to work for then Senator Obama the weekend of the announcement in Springfield. And aside from a slight detour electing the mayor here in Chicago in 2011, I've been working with him ever since, just kind of climbing my way up the rope.
Well, and just a quick follow-up, you said, a good way to learn the ropes. So what are the ropes that you have to learn on your journey up when it comes to communications inside, say, a House office in the context of these campaigns?
Well, I think there are a few things. I think ultimately media relations is a relationship based occupation. Certainly you have to be a good writer, you have to have creative ideas to try to drive the news every day. But if your job is being the press secretary, you have to know what reporters are thinking, where coverage is headed, how you can try to shape that coverage, what they might be interested in that would land in the newspaper or on the news. One of the things we'll talk more about is the fact that you can drive things directly now without the media filter, using digital and social media. But those are the sorts of things that you have to learn. And then there are all these sorts of things about politics and the legislative process that end up being more complicated than the bill becomes a law video that we all saw 20 years ago.
Yeah, well, and Kevin, that's a process you know well from your time on the Hill. What was your journey to being a senior advisor?
Well, first of all, I know Rahm Emanuel, and I'm going to tell him that you called him a slight detour. I can just imagine there's a few 4-letter words he's got for you, Ben.
He shared them all.
Let's see, where did it all go wrong for me? Well, look, I think to really explain my journey, you have to, my childhood, I think, and where I grew up had a very big impact on my chosen profession. I'm the son of 2 immigrants from Ireland, a nurse and a mechanic. And when I was growing up, I was a paper boy. And one of my father's customers was running for county legislator. And who better that knows the neighborhood and to talk directly? This is the beginning of what you would call canvassing. Who better knows the neighborhood than the paper boy? He knows everybody, what time they get home. He knows what they like, what they don't like. So my job was to help this guy who was on my paper route, who was a customer of my dad's, help him run for county legislature, was to get all my paper route and all of the other paper boys in the area to slide in some of his literature door to door. So that was the Yonkers Herald-Statesman back where I grew up, just outside of the Bronx. That was my first political campaigning. And the reward was, for all of those paper boys, was that we got to go to Rye Playland and go ice skating, where the Rangers used to practice. So that was our big reward. So that was basically how I started out in the door-to-door politics of campaigning. And it also fused what I always had, which was a love of news. When I grew up, my father, what he would do at the dinner table was he would make me read an article from the newspaper and report back to him and it always had some sort of moral story to it, you know. Some kid went to jail for lying, and therefore I had to read this article and talk to him about it, or write this was back in the days where, you know, right after Watergate, when Nixon was still a big thing, and I had to read an article about some elected official that had lied, and what was the moral of that story. But I learned to have a love of both politics and the political debate, as well as a love of journalism. My parents, also coming from Ireland, you know, it was a sin to sit in silence and not have an opinion. So I think it makes perfect sense that my brother is a lawyer and my sister was a journalist. So I learned a lot about public policy, and I learned a lot about politics, and I learned a lot about news and how that informs people's opinions. So anyway, when I went to college, I had a bit of a hybrid of studying both journalism and communications, as well as political science. And then when I left college, I went to work for my next door neighbor. Was running for mayor of Yonkers, and since I was a pretty good writer and I'd studied communications in college, and I had interned at one of the local, I'd interned at the local newspaper, and I'd also interned at a local TV station. He asked me to help him on the communication side of his campaign. And when he won, he asked me to come in and be then his press secretary for in the Yonkers City Mayor's office. And then I really just had a love of what was going on in Washington. I thought these are the big policy debates in the country, and I wanted to be a part of that. So I packed up my 1989 Ford Probe and drove down here and basically started working the shoe leather, trying to find a job up on Capitol Hill. Ended up working with a member from New York who was on the Appropriations Committee, and that was how I came up with the term. It wasn't earmarks, it was appropriations achievements in all the press releases that we sent out. So that was my first work at messaging. Yeah. So then I worked my way through Capitol Hill, and I ended up being asked to come work on the Bush Cheney campaign in '04, and worked there. And then after we had won there, I went back to work for the then House Majority Leader Tom DeLay. And when I tell you that there was a job that was fun and there was never a dull moment, it was working for Tom DeLay. But the good thing about it is when you're a press secretary for Tom DeLay, there's really nothing you can say wrong that the boss is going to come in and say, you really stepped over the line. So it was and you learn a lot about crisis communication when your guy's indicted, too. And then I ended up working for, when he left Congress, then I ended up working for John Boehner. And it was when I was working for John Boehner that some of my connections with the '04 campaign had come calling and said, look, Governor Romney up in Massachusetts is thinking about running for president. Your name was given to us as somebody who might be interested in working the '08 campaign. Will you come up to Boston and meet with them? And I went up and met with them. And I remember coming home and telling my wife then that I'd met the next president of the United States and we were moving to Boston. I was right about one of those. We definitely moved to Boston for a year and a half. And boy, that was like, you know, a conservative Republican living in Boston, also a Yankees fan. That was like being an orphan at a family picnic. And then here it is here. So that was how I kind of took a very similar route to Ben, but I did not insult Rahm Emanuel.
I think Tom DeLay is pretty offended. Finally.
Yeah, we'll come back. We'll talk Emanuel and DeLay later. But Massachusetts figures prominently in your own history and career arc, too. How did it unfold for you?
Well, a little bit similar to both of these guys. I grew up in an Irish immigrant family outside of Boston that was very politically active. Whether it was, you know, topics at the dinner table or going down to volunteer at the local Democratic Party or spending your nights in City Hall while your grandfather played cards with the city council members. That was always part of our life. I never knew I wanted to do it, but it was always part of our life. It was just how we were all sort of built. I, you know, did a presidential when I was in college, but it was more as a hobby. You know, it was my first presidential campaign. I was just registered to vote. It was the Dukakis campaign, to show you my age. And he was from Massachusetts. It was a really exciting time. You know, the campaign was based in Boston. And I literally would go out to Philadelphia on weekends or Baltimore or wherever they sent me and just canvassed every single weekend. And that's where I kind of caught the fever of politics. And after college, you know, like Ben, I had a weird calling for something that I was completely unqualified for. I thought I wanted to be an economist. And I was an economics major, but I should not have been an economist. And I actually wanted a job at the Fed when I graduated and was waiting for this job to come through, decided to move to Washington with a bunch of college friends and high school friends to just see what happened. And I arrived in Washington, got a waitressing job. Also got a temp job as I waited for this Fed job to come through. And the first day that the temp service sent me out, I answered phones for Mario Cuomo, who had a big office in Washington because New York gets a lot of their appropriation achievements from that city.
See, it broke through, that message.
We're going to trademark that.
And it was around the time that he was thinking about running for president. I had always loved Mario Cuomo. I had seen his convention speeches. He was sort of the it Democrat at the time. And I had just fallen in love with the guy. So here I am answering his phones, and I answered phones really well. And I got hired. But it was just random that this temp agency sent me to his office on that day, and that's what kind of started me on my political career. I ended up working for his, you know, preparation for a campaign for about a year, and he ultimately decided not to run, and I was crushed, thought my life was over. And I had done his speeches and done some policy work. So then I started law school and decided to put law school on hold and joined the Clinton campaign as an advance person and traveled the country doing advance for him. I continued going to law school at night. I ended up working random jobs in the Clinton administration, from his healthcare task force doing policy work and legal work, to the Environmental Protection Agency, the deputy chief of staff, a counselor to the administrator, press secretary, and then went back to the White House as the President Clinton's deputy communications director right around the time of impeachment, which was I guess you would call that a crisis. You know, great experience, trying experience, but really showed me the ropes. That was my first big communications job. I had been a press secretary, had been a policy advisor, a counselor, but that was my big first communications job. And my job was to divert attention from impeachment. So I had to come up with what we would call executive actions for the president to announce, so that, you know, the press would cover some child safety thing he had done instead of what the Senate debate was on, you know, what he did with Monica Lewinsky. You know, that was mildly successful, but it laid the groundwork for a pretty quick pivot after impeachment was finally done. So I served as his deputy communications director through the end of the Clinton administration. And then got lucky and went to work for Senator Kennedy, which was an amazing, amazing person to work for. And worked in the Senate, which is a great place to work if you're interested in politics, because that is politics at its core. And I was his communications director for many years, and got to see the legislative process up close. There was no better legislator in the Senate than Ted Kennedy, and in many ways, communicator, because he understood how to use the levers of the Senate, but also how to, you know, he had great long-standing press relationships and understood how to use those levers to get outside of Washington in places that we needed to mobilize. You know, I'm obviously from Massachusetts. Senator Kennedy was a senior senator from Massachusetts. John Kerry was running for president. John Kerry had, I really didn't have any interest in doing that campaign, but John Kerry had an upheaval in his campaign, and it was maybe 3 or 4 months before the Iowa caucus, and he was a good, you know, 20 points down in Iowa and New Hampshire. So I got asked to join that campaign for what we thought was going to be, you know, just a few months to get him through Iowa and New Hampshire, since he, you know, if you're from Massachusetts, you're also considered a son of New Hampshire. We needed to get him through New Hampshire.
And you just didn't want to go back on a campaign at that point?
I didn't, yeah, I didn't want to go back on a campaign. Yeah. No, I mean, I love Senator Kerry. He was one of my home state senators, but to join a presidential campaign, it's something that you normally proactively do. And
because of the commitment?
It's a significant commitment for your time. It's your life for however long that period is. And Kevin and Ben can attest to this. It's 24/7, particularly if you're in press and communications. You never shut off, you know, back then, you know, on previous campaigns there was a pager or a BlackBerry. Now it's your iPhone.
You go to sleep with the blue glow of the
Yes.
iPhone lighting up the room.
Yeah.
And
right there on your pillow.
Getting
Yes.
updates.
Yeah, it took me.
I wake up in the middle of the night.
We had Blackberries on the last campaign, and it took me 3 or 4 weeks. I was answering phantom buzzing from my leg, just picking up nothing, ready to go, ready to respond. It takes a while.
All right, so you're married to those devices
Yes.
and to the nonstop.
So the nonstop news cycle. It turned out to be a great experience. We ultimately won the Iowa caucus, won the New Hampshire primary, and it just kept going. Much to my dismay, though, you know, I obviously was thrilled by it. And we, you know, President Bush ended up winning that election. Thank you, Kevin. And we can talk about that later.
I'd love to talk about my most recent win from 8 years ago.
After that campaign, I went back to the Senate in a unique role where I worked half for Harry Reid, who was the minority leader at the time, and half for Ted Kennedy, to run caucus-wide campaigns. And really, I led the effort to take back the Senate in '06, and to develop the agenda, develop the messaging, work with consultants, work with the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee, which is the campaign arm for Senate Democrats. And we took back the Senate. I took a break from politics, opened up my own firm, ended up getting a call from David Axelrod sometime in 2008 about coming on the Obama campaign, and I was hesitant to do it. It was a role that I wasn't, had no experience in. It was to be Michelle Obama's chief of staff. And ultimately, I decided to do it, and it was one of the best decisions I ever made. And you know, from that campaign, ended up being the Obama-Biden transition spokesperson, did various jobs in the White House and the Treasury Department, and now I'm in Chicago.
Yeah.
Still taking a break after this campaign.
Well, it's amazing just to hear about these journeys and also to get a glimpse into sort of what daily life is like on a campaign. And I want to dig into that more deeply. But from this perspective, you know, most of us in the public
experience the campaign through the news media. Not exclusively, but certainly by and large, that's our main conduit. And yet, within a campaign, you have lots of communications mechanisms, whether it's grassroots or it's paid media. So where does the news media fit in the broader spectrum of the way the campaign views its process and its strategy? Kevin, what's your sense? And Ben?
Where the news media fits?
Yeah,
specifically?
So when you're thinking about earned media, how are you thinking about the role it plays? How important is it to the campaign strategy?
Well, it's changed in the sense that before, what you used to, it'd be before the advent of the technology to where we are today, with where campaigns, I think, are their own content creators and their own information networks. Before, it used to be that you would, the media had more of the balance of power, so that if you wanted to get word out to people in, for example, say Columbus, Ohio, you had to convince the Columbus Dispatch to sit down with your candidate, convince the local affiliates to sit down for an interview with your candidate, make sure that you had your advertising strategy directed towards them. And that you were spending dollars just making sure that eyeballs and ears were getting the information that you wanted to. And now there is, with technology, the power has sort of been flattened to the point where, except for the actual artifact of the newspaper coming and actually hitting someone's doorstep, the campaigns now have more power to control the message to go directly to the voter. So oftentimes the reporters now, the media, are witnesses to the conversation that you're having directly with voters, whereas before you needed them to have that conversation. And I think that's been the fundamental change that I've noticed from when I started from my first presidential campaign in 2004 to now. The other thing that I think really changed is the speed with which things happen. In 2004, and I've told this story over, I remember I would sit there and we would go over our meetings in the morning, our bracketing plan. We would go over our message meetings, the strategy, what everybody was doing and what they were saying to certain reporters, what the issues of the day were and what the response matrix was from a campaign. And you largely had until 3 o'clock maybe when the AP wire started ripping copy to get your story straight. And then in 2008, you'd come back from your 8 o'clock or your 6 o'clock meeting, depending on what meeting it was that you were in, whether it was senior staff or your communications meeting, and you'd already have the pressure of a story being developed that was going up on the web, that was going to be updated throughout the entire day, and then was going to drive an entire cable news cycle in the evening, and would then also end up on people's front step the next morning. And so now that is just, it is literally to the point where the news cycle starts at 6 a.m. and it goes all the way until 6 a.m. the next day. So, that is, I think, the fundamental change in the evolution, or in many ways devolution, of how the news media and the campaigns interact.
Ben and Stephanie, what are the other big changes you've noticed?
Well, there's one thing I'd like to add on to that. I mean, I think that Twitter has made every reporter a wire reporter and brought in some normal people into the process, and that really has picked up the speed of things, to which the morning and evening news almost have no resemblance to each other when it comes to politics. You can have multiple news cycles within one day. You talked about how do all the pieces fit together, the departments fit together. On a good day, everybody's swimming in the same direction. You've got your candidate out making an announcement. There's an ad that goes up from the paid media department. The political team is doing outreach, getting people to go out and put statements saying that they agree with this or this is a good plan. But there are a lot of days when that's not possible. And an ad this election cycle might go up in a single television market in Columbus, Ohio, because we know exactly what the composition of undecided voters are there, and they're looking for something different than people are looking for in Orlando. But that doesn't mean that that's the national message that we're going to put out throughout the course of the day. It also makes our jobs easier in that we can reach people directly without the media filter, but it also makes it more difficult because little pieces of information float. They might be wrong, but people run with them the second they hit Twitter. So there's a certain amount of whack-a-mole that goes on.
I was going to say, how much of this is about offense? How much of this is about defense?
Well, I think the sort of rule on campaigns is that if you're defending, you're losing. You should try to be on offense. and pitching stories that help your candidate at least 70% of the time, and dealing with incoming 30% of the time. But that's why every campaign now needs a rapid response team that can not only deal with attacks from the other candidate, but also picks up these little pieces of information that are wrong. And it requires you to do difficult things like try to disprove a negative and other hard tasks in a timeline where you're not negotiating with a reporter who's saying, I'm going with this in 4 hours if you can't present evidence. This thing is online and being covered on cable, and you're running around trying to extinguish it.
I want to get to some more specific elements in the 2012 campaign, but there's been a few bits of jargon tossed out. A bracketing plan, response matrix, rapid response team. Break those down for me. What are those elements?
Well, yeah, you go ahead. Sorry.
Well, back to your offense, defense, and Ben's comment that if you're not playing offense, then you're losing. On a campaign, you literally plan out weeks ahead of time what type of news that you're going to be driving, so that you can plan everything that comes underneath it, which would be getting your political supporters to say the right things, having a digital strategy to communicate directly to voters. You know, let's remember Obama had, in 2008, we had 13 million people on our email list. Obviously, that grew in 2012. And we had 33 million people on our Facebook, 33 million people. More than 90% of every US person on Facebook, American person on Facebook, is friends with somebody who's friends with Barack Obama on Facebook. So we had a number of different communications tools. Media was one of them. But every single day, we had it completely planned out on what we were hoping to drive. So we weren't waiting for something to come to us, we drove it. Now, if something came at us, there were different people who had different jobs on the campaign. You know, a group of people, normally the guys that ran the regional press, were in charge of looking at where Mitt Romney was at any given time and planning events in that media market to screw with his coverage. That's what we called bracketing. If the Romney campaign planted a bad story, or if they were launching some attack from the stump, our rapid response team would figure out how to hit back. And that rapid response team was in touch with every single reporter who was traveling with Romney or covering Romney every single day, all day long.
On your team?
On the communications team. Ben was the national press secretary and dealt with both the incoming and outgoing at a certain level of reporter, what we would call our A-list reporters, and helped drive whatever story that we were driving that day.
A-list reporters being national correspondents who are really influential.
Yeah, the White House press corps and your national political reporters.
Yeah, and what's the relationship between that level of a journalist for, say, the Obama campaign or the Romney campaign, and your local reporter at the Columbus Dispatch, or even, you know, your local anchor at an evening news station where you're trying to get just a quick hit?
There, you know, everybody, I guess it's still true that the national media sets the national narrative. But if you look at the quality or the weight of that reporting for voters on the ground, which ultimately, if you're in a campaign, that's your only test. What's the voter going to think about this? Their local media had a lot more influence over the types of information that they were getting and whether it was being persuasive. So the Obama campaign, even back in 2008, put a primary on local press. And all the way through the first term at the White House, we put a primary on local press, because that was a very trusted source for people back home. So the family living in Columbus was more likely, was 100% more likely to be reading the Columbus Dispatch than they would be reading the New York Times. And they'll have the 5:30 news on while they're cooking dinner. So that's always part of your calculation. It used to be that, as Kevin said, that your news cycle was so much longer or confined, I guess, in 2004 and previous campaigns, that if you got something in the New York Times, you could get it on the nightly news, the network news, and that would set the coverage for the entire next day. That's no longer true. If you get something in the New York Times, people are past that by 10 a.m. And what gets on the evening news is sort of a crapshoot, and something that you have to work all day. It does have influence in terms of what reporters locally are covering, but you need to have your own communication with those local reporters.
What about your plan for the Twitterverse and specifically? Walk me through how you thought about social media on a daily basis. Kevin?
Well, I'll give you a quick case study on it. When the Supreme Court decision came down on the healthcare, we brought a whole bunch of people together. At that time, I had just gone over to the RNC and was liaisoning between Boston and the RNC. We were just at that point where we were becoming the official nominee. And we brought together all the sort of working levers of the Republican message machine, which was the NRCC and the Congressional Republican Campaign Committee, the Senatorial Campaign Committee, the RNC, Boston, and even the RGA and some of the AGs, the organizations that they were also at the table. And we thought about, okay, well, what is the scenario going to look like when this thing comes down? And it used to be, the old model was that you said, okay, we're going to get a white paper, right? And then we're going to take a look at, we're going to read the response, and we're going to get some of our policy people out there on maybe television, or we're going to do a conference call, and we're going to sit down and sort of walk through a lot of the reporters on this. And at some point during our discussions, I remember we came to the collaborative conclusion that this thing was going to be won in the first 30 minutes with a hashtag. So that was the first time where I thought, okay, Twitter's had a really big impact on how it is that the cables will start to cover it, and how reporters, like you said, Ben, which is a very important point, which is that they all became wire reporters in a sense. And that hashtag, and how we all said, okay, what are the different scenarios that could happen, and what's the different message or the tailored message for each scenario, and then what's the hashtag for it? What's that micro message that we want to drive?
And when you say what I lost in the first 30 minutes, you're talking about how the story is framed.
So
done.
What happens usually is that the word comes around, it's like, hey, yeah, turn on the cable news. Apparently the SCOTUS decision came down and we've got it. And a lot of what people were doing, where they were getting this there was an aggregation of opinion about whether it was a win or a loss, good, bad, a good thing for Mitt Romney, a bad thing for Mitt Romney, a good thing for the president, a bad thing for the president. And it was all going to happen on Twitter. We believe that in those first 30 minutes, how it was that everybody responded was going to have an impact on the coverage. So that was a really important case study, I think, on how.
And so how did you mobilize?
So we mobilized by basically having different Twitter handles, different hashtags for each different scenario. When I say different scenarios, like was it upheld, but was the entire bill upheld? Or was only half of it upheld? Did the mandate upheld, but something else, other parts of it fell? So we had all these different scenarios, and then everybody had an agreed upon theme that we were going to push as Republican communicators across the entire Republican sort of message machine.
And how do you do that in a fast-moving cycle?
Yeah,
make sure that all your surrogates are on the same.
26-0 vote.
Yeah.
Well, it was difficult, but it was just a lot of hard work, to tell you the truth. I think it was particularly difficult given Governor Romney's his history on the issue with the Massachusetts health care and how Democrats were using it against us, and quite frankly, how some of our toughest critics within the Republican Party were worried we weren't going to be the best messenger.
So what was your frame there? What was the line you were trying to walk, given his history in Massachusetts, knowing that this decision was coming down?
That the electorate was not going to make their decision based on the past. They were going to make their decision based on what your remedy was for the future of health care. And to tell you the truth, that was not necessarily a very overwhelming win inside the Romney campaign. There were a lot of folks that said, no, we have to explain what we did in Massachusetts as XYZ before we can ever get to that argument, versus the folks inside the campaign who were saying, this is not about the past, this is about the future. Talk about healthcare as a value, talk about it as what your remedy is for people's differences with the ACA and what healthcare should look like going forward.
So we can stay with this example or move to another one, but I'm curious to know, let's flip it to the Obama campaign. What was happening simultaneously on that day, to when it came to social media and the other communication?
Very similar. We had various scenarios in play, various systems in place, depending upon the decision, whether it was completely upheld, whether they overturned the mandate, or overturned the entire law. We felt pretty confident that the law was going to be upheld, and we had various things prepared. We had, for quite some time before that, been putting out, digital clips of people talking about how the law had already impacted their lives, and to very much show to the American people and to the media that this law was part of the American fabric now. People were relying on it. And of course, the flip of that is that Mitt Romney wants to take these things away from you. And so, that we had done a lot of work in the lead up to the decision to lay some groundwork and soften the ground of what people were already thinking about the law. And, the law at that point still remained very unpopular. I think we were still over 50% in disapproval. But when you ask the question whether they wanted it to go away, or if you ask the question about the specific provisions of the law, those numbers changed dramatically. So we were very much spending time breaking the law down and communicating how it was already benefiting people in key states, and then preparing ourselves for what would happen on the Supreme Court day. I don't remember if we had a hashtag, but I do remember that we had an email out to our 13 million person list.
The other kind of big moment that day was that CNN got it wrong.
Right.
And they went with it first. And they ran out and they'd only read a portion of the ruling. And they went with it first. And that just speaks to, having your 26 different organizations on the line and making sure nobody goes until they get the signal internally that this is actually happening, because a major outlet got it wrong, and we were monitoring, whatever we'd hear from our lawyers, but the wonky SCOTUS blog to see if they read the ruling. But that shows we had a very specific plan, but you have to adapt. And the debate became about, was this going to be a tax? Yeah. And we can argue, maybe John Roberts was the smartest politician in the room. Because, for all of our planning and ability to address that question, the debate quickly shifted territory, no matter for how many months responses had been planned out. And so that's what, we got a few hours of coverage that said a win was a win for the president, but then it quickly shifted to that political debate between the two campaigns that we had to adapt to.
Go ahead.
And I mean, we don't have to stay on healthcare for that much longer, but just to show you how quickly that day moved, didn't Governor Romney take a question on whether it was a tax?
He did, yeah. And then I think there's the next day that Fernstrom went on the air and argued that it wasn't a tax.
Right. So
that was, for all the planning we did, a moment that was atomized on cable television threw a big wrench into it. I mean, we didn't sit around planning that out, right? All those meetings that we had at the RNC, nobody said, and by the way, when Fernstrom says something different on Rundown, then we're going to, here's the other rest of that plan. Like, it just goes to show you that even the greatest plan is, it's perfect until it meets an enemy.
But both campaigns are watching so closely what the other campaign is doing. As soon as Governor Romney said, if I remember this correctly, he likened it to the law in Massachusetts and that it was a tax. So we jumped on that and said, well, see, we told you, his law is the same as the president's law, and why is he running away from his one singular accomplishment in Massachusetts? And the next day, when Fernstrom said what he said, that it disagreed with Romney, we obviously were watching that very closely and jumped on that. And that's obviously what campaigns do. Yep. And that's what our rapid response team, and same with the Romney campaign, that's what they were so good at, looking for that sliver and just driving a Mack truck right through it.
The late writer David Foster Wallace, in an essay describing our current media landscape, or recent media landscape, described it as an environment of total noise. And in the scenario you laid out, it's easy to see why it's an environment of total noise. Lots of things happening incorrectly, all at the same time, moving in different directions. The campaign not always aligned on the messaging. So how hard is it, and what do you do to try and maintain strategic focus on the broader messaging in the context of an environment where you have, millions upon millions of tweets and other messaging that's coming at you, and unexpected gaffes and crises?
Well, I think there is a science to it, and the human component, the quality of the candidate and campaign really matters. But people have been doing this for a long time now, and there's a research-driven process going to focus groups of undecided voters in the key markets that you're going to need to win. Polling on key questions, throwing in different questions each week to see what's going to move voters, or if a new issue in the news is having an impact on the people that you need to have an impact on. So we, this time around, had the luxury of planning for the general election over the course of a year, while Kevin and Governor Romney were tied up with a primary and had to deal with some short-term challenges. And so we were able to test a lot of material and a lot of arguments and figure out what was the most effective over the course of that year, and we're able to chart out very specifically the arguments and contrasts that we want to make week by week as the general election began. And you know, some of the things we learned included the fact that you know, the contrasts that probably got the most attention from us were the arguments about Romney's business career, but we found out that if we said that he said he'd do all the same things in Massachusetts that he'd do today and he didn't do them in Massachusetts, well, people didn't really know about that experience, and that resonated a lot. So we had a plan to say this month will be dedicated to making these arguments. So we'd always go back to our layers of data and our numbers and our research process to figure out if what we were saying was working, or if a mistake was made, how big of an impact it had on our chances.
I want to get to questions in a few minutes, but who wanted to jump in on that?
I was just going to say that, to Ben's point, that we had everything charted out, which it was a true luxury. And I've been on the other side of it, where you're coming out of a primary against an incumbent president, and it is almost impossible to get ahead of yourself at that point. If you're running against someone who's been planning their campaign for well over a year at that point. But we had everything charted out, and you know, we're very data driven in terms of, as Ben said, what arguments were best at supporting the president, and you know, undermining Romney's core argument, which was his economic experience. And everything we did was through that lens. So there were many things that came our way that we didn't hit on, or that we didn't defend, because it was noise. And if it didn't fit through that prism, or if we didn't think it ultimately was going to be a problem for the president, and we had real-time data, you know, there were focus groups 2 or 3 times a week. We were in the field almost every night. We had this online universe of people that our pollsters had, where we were throwing arguments out to them every night and seeing how they were reacting. So we had some real-time information about the news flow. So, you know, we were pretty calculating in what we were driving and what we thought we had to react to. So, as I'm sure is true on Kevin's campaign, there were dozens of things that the Romney campaign tried to get started that we just didn't take the bait on. And lots of things that we tried to get started that the Romney campaign wouldn't take the bait on, because it wasn't part of your overarching narrative or strategy.
Yeah. Well, in a world where there's a wealth of information, there's always a poverty of attention. So in order to break through that debate, you really do have to have the discipline and a campaign that is focused on answering one big question, or directly trying to connect your candidate to some major anxiety or a major characteristic that the candidate, that the voter is looking for, the persuadable voter is looking for. And I was very impressed with what the Obama campaign did as far as that message discipline and answering those characteristics for those voters that yet to make up their mind. And I think if you go back and look at everything they did, it all answered a series of big questions. And they were questions that really mattered. And to as Ben pointed out, and Stephanie pointed out, it was all data driven. This is not something like they were like, hey, you know what would be a great message? I was in the shower the other day, and I thought, yeah.
We did that and we tested it. Right. It was a terrible idea.
But you go back and you look, and in hindsight, I've got 2020, and there are 3 big themes that came out of everything they did. And it was, this is an economy, we need an economy that's built to last. We need an economy that's built from the middle out. And this is a question of who's on your side. And that was encoded in the DNA of everything that the Obama campaign did, from the ads to the president's speeches to his what looked like off-the-cuff retorts during debates to the scripts that volunteers were reading over the phone to their identified other persuadable voters. And that is the difference between a winning campaign and a losing campaign. Look, I think we made an effort to do the same.
Well, yeah, what was going on in your
So when we were at our best, we were making the argument about this is not an economy about, this is not an argument the country, this is not about who you like, this is about where the country's going. And when we prospered, we were answering that, we were having persuadable voters ask themselves that question every single day. The problem, I think, the challenge that we had is, and this is what happens during campaigns, and I give them credit, and we've learned from some of our mistakes, is that you can never get tired of your own message. And there were many times during this campaign where we were answering character questions about taxes, we were talking about Bain, and we were campaigning very focused on tactics. And tactics are very important, but there's nothing that can replace a really strong message that matters to the person who's yet to make up their mind.
Tactics are sexy because they're easier to get in the paper. There's something new, and reporters always want to say, you've told me this 1,000 times.
Yeah.
And so it's difficult. You need tactics that fit within your strategic framework to keep them relevant.
So give me an example of what you mean by tactics.
Well, I'll give you one quick, to that point, I'll give you a quick one that I was always reminded of is, you know, in a campaign, you can oftentimes, there's so much anecdotal evidence that we're like, oh, we're going to win this, man. I just feel it, you know? Don't listen to the polls. They're all wrong. And what happened was the campaign, oftentimes, when you focus on tactics, you get these emails inside the campaigns, right? Because we all have this devotion to metrics. And the metrics would come back, it's like, we had this bracketing plan put together, and I saw the emails today. We sent these many emails out to this many reporters, and here are all the people that we had booked on radio in all these target states, and here are all the interviews that we did in all these target states. And it's like, great job, everybody. We're making progress. And then you step back and you say to yourself, well, wait a minute, we booked a bunch of people on radio and a bunch of people on TV, and they all got their heads handed to them on Bain and taxes today. So while we had the tactics down and we thought we had everybody everywhere, they were in a defensive crouch and a defensive posture, not talking to that persuadable voter about what really matters to them. Who's on, you know, to answering the question, is Mitt Romney on my side? Does he understand the problems of people like me, which is always a fundamental attribute question that you have to answer in the affirmative. And so all the tactics in the world, we've got our bracketing plans, right? All the jargon, we've had really great meetings. Good job on that spreadsheet with all those bookings where we were getting our heads.
Let me update the response matrix.
Yeah. Put that in the response matrix. So, you know, for the aspiring campaign operatives in this room, first of all, you're crazy. Second of all, you know, these are the lessons that, particularly in this reflective period after the campaign, that it's very important that you're very clinical about what works and what doesn't. And at the end of the day, it's the message that matters. So.
Let me invite you to come up for questions. I think we have a microphone, hopefully, that we'll bring up here to the front. Mm-hmm. We'll bring it in. And then once it's set up, you can line up behind the microphone to answer your question. And I would just ask that you keep your questions succinct as we try to get through as many as we possibly can. As people line up and we get the microphone set, though, I want to come back to something you said at the outset, Ben, about the key to this work from certainly a relationship standpoint is building good relationships with reporters. What's the secret to that?
The secret is this, that the media is portrayed as being monolithic, but it's not, and that you have to figure out who you're able to work with and who you trust with information and who you trust to give you a fair treatment. And you know, you deal with a series of reporters, national reporters, local reporters, reporters who don't cover politics but might be interested or might cover an issue that you're working on, and I think that takes time. And you know, at the end of it, you end up with a certain list of reporters who you really trust with any information, or you trust to give you fair treatment when they call. If they call, they're going to be honest about the story that you're working on, and that makes you want to be more forthright with them. And the truth is, there are reporters who are more difficult to work with. They've burned you in the past, or you don't think that the elected official you're working for has gotten fair treatment from them, and you're going to be more cautious. Maybe you'll just email them one line without spending an hour trying to get everybody on the phone to disprove the point that they're working on, because you think that they'd value that and take that into account. And it's a fluid process. It's not one that's ever complete, and it takes time to figure out the landscape. But I think anybody, particularly if you're going to be a spokesperson, that's what you spend a lot of your time doing, is figuring out what that landscape is.
And just a quick follow on that. What's your biggest critique of political reporting today?
You want to ask him first, or
Why don't you dive right
I'm
in?
sure we got
You
2
guys
hours.
handle it.
I think that there is a. I think that I worry that given this shorter attention span that many reporters have, and the instant analysis that they all tend to be more geared towards in this this news cycle now that never really ends.
And are called upon to provide by the organization.
That they become more like trackers than they do become reporters. I mean, there's so many times, I always tell the story about how when you would go to New Hampshire and you would be at an event that we would have with Governor Romney, this particularly in 08, where all of a sudden you turn around and David Broder would be there. Now, David Broder wasn't on the bus, he wasn't on the plane, he wasn't, complaining about how come there was no buffet at the last event, and there's no.
For those who may not know who David
Broder
is,
of the Washington Post.
Yeah.
He was the dean of the Republic of the press corps, the Washington Press Corps. And so a lot of the
alumnus here,
yeah, a lot of the the kind of delicate balance that you have back and forth with journalists and press secretaries, that was gone because he had spent 2 days there traveling the state, and he had spent time in Lions clubs and VFWs talking to people, learning, listening, finding out the fabric of the argument that was taking place and what was driving people's opinions about their race, versus just following us from event to event and then reporting on the last gaffe that was had at an event. And I think that's something that I just worry about as somebody who has a real respect for the the greats, the Eric Severides of the world, and people like David Broder, who would just tell great stories. And I think contemporaries now like Dan Balls, you miss a lot of that. And I think instead it's let's tweet what the last screw up was at the last event, and that's probably what my main critique.
Let me hold off on responses from the other two to get to some questions, and then feel free to chime in with that as we go. Yeah, Nicole.
Thank you. This is a question for all the panelists.
Come up close to the
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. This is a question for all the panelists, and I was just wondering, in the context of the very prescripted strategy plans, were there any points during the election where the press took something in a very unexpected direction?
Every day.
Who wants to start there? Anything comes to mind for you, Stephanie?
Well, I wouldn't say unexpected, because you kind of have to expect everything. I mean, again, this wasn't unexpected, but the reaction after the first debate, and lots of media thought that we had lost the campaign with that one debate, but there was not one piece of hard evidence or data that showed that. And our numbers didn't move. Romney's got a little bit better, but ours didn't move. Certainly the numbers in the state didn't move. But the narrative, there were at least 10 days between the first and second debate. That entire time we dealt with, did we just lose the campaign?
That line of questioning coming, you're on hardball, or you.
Oh, it was nonstop. And what went wrong, and what did the president just not prepare? But that's all expected if you lose a debate, but not the severity of you just lost the campaign. And even up until Election Day, there were many reporters that we couldn't convince that we were going to win. And we knew well ahead of the first debate that we had a high probability of winning. Again, there was not one piece of hard evidence that showed any major shift after that first debate. But the media, they need a story to write every single day. Mm-hmm. And they need a race to cover. So if it's not a race, they're out of a job. So they need to manufacture things that make it a race. And we dealt with that at many moments during the campaign. So I don't know if you guys, do you think
I have one that actually from the mayor's race here in 2011, we did an event where then non-mayor Rahm Emanuel proposed a sales tax to lower the sales tax, but to add a couple of goods to broaden the base. And this became the main thing that our opponents used against us. The Tribune headline on this, it played well in every other outlet, but the Tribune headline was, Emanuel hikes taxes on goods. And so the entire point of this event was to lower the sales tax. And so I was on the phone with everybody at the Tribune from the bottom to the top, from the mailroom to the top floor. I got so mad that I gave them some crazy quote like, green is brown, Christmas is Thanksgiving, lowering sales taxes means raising sales taxes. It just got to such an unreasonable point, but it became, because of that headline, an issue for the rest of the race that we dealt with every day. So there's certainly some moments of frustration where you just can't win.
Vice Chair?
Hi, thank you. Well, in the course of a general election, in the regional media market, there usually is not just the presidential race, but also even within one's own party, there is a national committee, and there are like state and local office seekers. And a lot of times, their messages may not always be in sync. How much has this been a factor in the past election, and how did either camp deal with it? Thank you.
Yeah, I think the bigger challenge for a lot of those local races is breaking through in the presidential, to tell you the truth. I think that's the harder part of it. There are a few incidents where you have a local candidate that said something outrageous that you essentially have to answer for. I think the media tends to make a very big deal of those, but in the larger scheme of how voters then make up their mind, I think it's much more. It's not as directly, there's not as a direct correlation as the media makes. I think an example of that would be, in many of these states where I think we had candidates saying very unfortunate things about the horrific crime of rape in the context of a debate over life choices. Those were very big problems for us because we're trying to drive an economic argument, and here we are trying to manage our way out of a social issue debate. And that was something that was very difficult, and oftentimes the best way to deal with it, to tell you the truth, is just to take a direct argument to the media that's inquiring about it with where you disagree, and then you have to just move on. And then try and create a new market share of information on the message that you do want to drive, which was the economy. That it does prove difficult, and it is something that I think is going to continue happening. You have so many candidates out there, and so many people aren't singing off the same song sheet.
Yeah. Next question.
Thank you for being here tonight. I had a question. We touched upon it briefly tonight, but if any of you would be willing to speak more to how rapidly evolved the social campaign was in 2012, specifically with Twitter, and then if you want to make a brave statement about how you think it might play into 2016 as an even bigger role.
Well, I mean, if you look at how people get information, not just news, but information, almost half of them, their primary source is online. So on your iPhone or, iPad or computer. And so our digital communications was a pretty big part of what we did. And, the Obama world sometimes takes criticism from the media that we go around them to get to voters or the American people, which, whether we're running for a re-election or if we're just governing. And we do employ every tool possible to have that communication because it's completely unfiltered. I think that media will always be part of campaigns. But in the next round of campaigns, even putting out, we started this thing called the Truth Team, which broke through to Obama supporters that then they forwarded to their friends, and the universe kept growing with these concentric circles. And we used that before we went up with advertising. We used those YouTube videos to hit back on what Karl Rove was putting on the air. And over the course of the campaign, those YouTube videos, not just those Truth Team videos, but all of our YouTube videos had something like 133 million views. That's a lot of people, and that's basically free for us. So I would imagine that that type of communication explodes in the next round of campaigning. Also Facebook, I mentioned before we had 33 million people that were friends of Barack. It was much more qualitative for us, a much higher value of communication if we got those friends of Barack to communicate with their Facebook friends. So we just gave them tools, whether it was infographics, boiling down a policy so that it was easily explainable, or a simple blog post, or a short video of something that they could share with their friends with their own marker on it. And they became our online ambassadors. That was a much more valuable piece of communication for us than some quote we were giving to a newspaper or somebody that we were booking on cable.
And the persuasion effect was greater.
Absolutely, because it was a trusted source.
Well, yeah, why do you think that is? Elaborate more on the trusted source versus, you know, everything else that might be a source of
Well, it's just really simple. I mean, just look at your own lives. If your friend tells you something about something that they heard about a particular policy or person, and you know, you trust that person, that information is going to have a significant weight on you, versus turning on the TV and seeing me say something. You know, you don't know me. I'm, you know, a hired gun, and you know, in your head, you're weighing these pieces of information, and you know, there's a greater value to your trusted sources.
Well, you're not giving yourself enough credit, because I know we tested those videos, and they were very, very persuasive, and they had a great impact on folks. And I think what the reason they did was because they were personalized in the sense that people did begin to feel like they knew Stephanie, and she did become a trusted source.
They don't know. Yeah. You've got these white.
The YouTube whiteboards, right?
The Truth Team videos.
The Truth Team videos, right? And they were online, and we had ways to look at them and work with some of the real-time feedback on whether or not people would judge the message in the videos positively, and whether they believed it, and whether they liked it, and what they liked about it, and whether they were willing to share it. And they were. People were willing to share it.
And describe what the videos
they were just
like, for those who aren't part of the 133 million.
Too. But they were just very simple videos of somebody from the campaign.
Straight to camera.
Straight to camera. Usually me, sometimes Ben, a couple of other people, just breaking down an argument in very, very simple terms and explaining what was right and what was wrong. Obviously, we would have our own spin on it. But it was just a very simple communication of, you know, it was basically a free ad in a very personal way. You know, our first one was, you know, Karl Rove went up with an ad on Solyndra, which we knew could be a persuasive argument against the president. And we weren't yet up on the air with advertising, so this must have been March or April. And we decided just to do a video, a direct-to-camera video, where I just went through Karl Rove's ad and said, he says this, here's why that's not true. And oh, by the way, Mitt Romney, whatever you know, Republican super PAC put out against us, we would turn it back to Romney. So we were knocking down something that was being thrown at us, but we were turning the argument back to Romney. And these were very short. You know, you couldn't really do more than 2.5 minutes before somebody would turn it off. But it turned into a very effective tool. It would drive media. And it, you know, various aspects of the campaign, the political department would send it out to the political folks so they knew what we were saying. The fundraising team would use it for fundraising purposes. So it became, and you know, obviously it was one of those things that if you got it on your email from your friend, you know, you were likely to hit send on your email to all of your contacts and forward it. So that's what we try to do with those things.
Let me try to get these last two questions. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you all for being here again. From what I've gathered, it sounds like the shelf space in the form of social media is sort of overcrowded, particularly for the media. A lot of reports being released that they're kind of upset about that. Do you think that there will be a shift back towards more investigative reporting about the candidates to provide a more well-rounded sort of picture of who they are?
I think that the media actually has to innovate too. There was, I tweeted a couple weeks ago, and it upset a lot of reporters. I tweeted this same point. There was a story in Politico that talked a little bit what Kevin was talking about earlier, the balance of power shifting back towards the government. But the point of the story was that that was happening because now the White House can put out its own videos, its own material, its own tweets. The media still serves as a check on that. Many of these things are released to drive coverage, which then reporters will analyze. But all of these innovations are necessary because the audience is moving to digital platforms. And so any candidate who doesn't engage on digital platforms, I think, does so at their own peril. And if these allow candidates and elected officials to have more direct conversations with Americans and voters, then I think the media also has an opportunity to find ways to engage Americans more directly. And there are a lot of news outlets that are thinking about that. ABC partnered with Yahoo, one of the biggest online platforms, and they're shifting a lot of their coverage during the day online in a context in which you can tweet a response, you can ask a question online. There's a lot more direct engagement. But I think that's part of the question, is how you become relevant for where the audience is moving. In some ways, this has democratized who can be that investigative reporter. If so many people are in on the conversation, a small piece of information that they have about an elected official might get to a larger platform very quickly. You still need editors and quality journalists to weigh in on the process and be the referee for the facts. But I think everybody should see an opportunity here to use those digital platforms to expand the conversation, involve more people, and reach a larger audience.
Let me ask a related question that comes back to your role. I mean, one of the common critiques is that communications directors, press secretaries, this is a world, and consultants as well, this is a world of spinning, evasions, distortions. What's your response when you hear that argument about the work that you and your colleagues do in this space?
I would say anytime before we go out and say something, we go through a long process to make sure that it's factual, to think through the questions that will come in. We have a case that we want to present. It's almost like being an attorney. And we make sure it's factual. We go out and make that case, and our own credibility is on the line, because everybody up here didn't just work for one politician one time. And we're going to have to call up those same journalists and make those same cases. And if you get it wrong or you lie to a reporter once, that might be your whole career, because your credibility is on the line. And of course, there are some things that might be unflattering. You're not going to go out and share that the first time around, but if a reporter's gotten a tip that your boss did something that might create an unsavory story, well, then it's your obligation to answer those things in a factual way, and to have that exchange with the reporter that hopefully put some explanation and context around what they did. But I would say that your credibility could go away very quickly.
Yeah, I'd say that the real tension between what we do and what reporters do is that I have yet to meet a reporter who didn't think they could run a better campaign, and I've yet to meet a press secretary who didn't think they could write a better story. And that tension is okay. We have to accept it and deal with it. And I think that's a healthy tension to have, because how many times, right, have you called up a reporter and said, the real story here is, and what you should be writing, whereas they've called us and say, why are you guys doing that? That sounds dumb. You know? So but most important, I think, is that you have to have a vocational aspect to what you do. I think all of us have worked for people we truly, absolutely believe in, whether or not we believe that they're the right people, and we might not vote for the guys that we work with, but I truly believe Mitt Romney would have been a great president. Tom DeLay was one of the best Republican whips you ever saw. I mean, he could turn a bill that looked like it was going to die into something that was passed and the president would sign. And we care greatly about these folks. So the vocational aspect of the issues that we believe in and the people that we work for is so important. But lastly, I think it's the professional ethos that you have to have, in the sense that you have to be a broker of the truth, not a broker of just spin. Spin is a fancy way, I think, of saying, like Ben said, it's our side of the story in the court of public opinion. And we have facts that we want to present in order to persuade people. But the professional ethos that we have is brokering the truth, and oftentimes making sure that inside a campaign that you're doing that, which is there'll be a bunch of people who say, let's just go out there and tell them X. Well, X would be a lie. And we can't go out there and say that. We have to go out there and present the argument that's true and that's factual and that's persuadable. And reporters will always respect that, because they'll know that you're dealing with somebody who's worked this internally inside the campaign and is a broker for the truth. Now, you're not going to get all the information you need, but that you're going to broker the truth. And that's critical to, I think, those relationships that Ben talks about, because you lie to a reporter once, they'll never call you again, and you're out of the business.
Let's take this last question and some closing comments from David.
Thank you guys again for coming. And we kind of touched on this a little earlier, but during every election year and presidential campaign, you've always got these talking heads that come out in full force, from Ann Coulter to Glenn Beck. And you know, it's a bit of a circus, but how does that impact what you do, and how do you guys deal with it? Thank you.
That's the echo chamber.
Yeah.
You can either choose to engage in the echo chamber or realize that ultimately that's not going to impact votes. And there were many days in this campaign that I didn't even turn on my TV. I mean, I'd walk down the hall to, we had a satellite chair set up in the middle of the campaign where we all did interviews. Oftentimes I'd walk down to that chair having not seen TV all day, because you didn't want that to get in your head. There are some people that are part of that circus that matter more than others. But ultimately, you're on a presidential campaign, you got to take care of that chatter, but your focus is what's the guy in Des Moines, Iowa hearing? And they're probably, unless they're part of Ann Coulter's email list, they're probably not hearing Ann Coulter. So, you just have to...
If they are, they've made up their mind.
Right.
Pretty much.
So, but
how many people on that email list are like, oh,
exactly.
I'm holding out.
If Ann Coulter is swaying someone, they're not our voters.
Yeah. Let me check what she underlined.
But, you have to create your own echo chamber. And, some of those people you can work with, and you have to figure out who those people are and how you can leverage them to work in your favor, or how you create new ones. And we did that. Figuring out who we could, tell our argument to, and they could be messengers in their community, or on TV, or online, or on radio. And so, I mean, I guess Ann Coulter's an extreme example of that. On our side, it would be, I don't want to compare somebody to Ann Coulter.
Yeah, well, like Ed Schultz.
Ed Schultz, who's, dyed-in-the-wool progressive. He would oftentimes disagree with us, but he's somebody that we did work with to make sure that he at least understood where we were coming from.
Actually, I think the most extreme example, and the one that you guys had to wrestle with at times, was Rush Limbaugh.
Yeah.
Right.
And when he attacked a young law student from Washington over the contraception issue, that was an issue. That wasn't,
Yeah.
I mean, so these guys and gals can create issues for you. But we have no more issues to discuss tonight. So I want to say I have the honor of working with these two every single day, and there aren't two more talented people in this business than these guys. And Kevin, I remember when you re-saddled up for the Romney campaign. That was a bad day around our headquarters, because you're so obviously talented, and we all knew that. So we liked it better when you were in the private sector.
So did I.
So did you.
So did my wife. And my 3 boys.
But we're really, really lucky to have all of you here tonight. And when we're talking about great communicators, I got to throw my buddy Steve Edwards in here as well. So thank you for a very illuminating discussion.
Thank you all very much.